So last year I put out a video reviewing Kingdom Hearts 3 and there was actually quite a lot to talk about. But there was also the distinction that there was more to come via DLC and updates. So I figured it'd be fair to take a second look at the game to see if these updates changed my feelings on it, or if my previous thoughts have changed over time. I tried approaching the game differently from the other times I played it, thinking it would help me explore and understand its mechanics a bit more. So I finally got around to beating the game again, as well as the Remind DLC. And in several ways, the game actually got better over time. But in other ways, it also got sour. I'm going to focus specifically on the gameplay this time around since it's really the most prominent point of discussion. There's honestly really not much I can say about the story that I didn't say last time. I might bring it up a little more considering the additions they made with Remind and how some cutscenes received updates, but we'll be saving that for later. The combat for starters, especially when compared to the handheld titles, is a huge improvement over a lot of previous entries in the series. This is easily Osaka Team's best feat at a Kingdom Hearts game so far, and it's really telling that they've been gaining experiences from previous attempts. There's a lot of familiarity to Kingdom Hearts 2's combat in many areas, more so than a lot of people tend to give it credit for. There's some pretty fluid movements and a sense of momentum to how Sora flows, and there's a lot of added mechanics to airtime so you're able to do more stuff off the ground. I also found myself being able to do more ground combos when I wanted to use them, so you're not constantly being forced into aerial combos. It's a touch of freedom that gives you the option to use certain types of combos without the choice being made for you, though I do personally prefer aerial combos since there's a number of advantages to them. But whichever type of combos you use, there's never any inconsistency as your attacks connect and chain together very well. The first strike in Sora's aerial combo has a really good reach, allowing you to quickly close in on enemies from a distance. After defeating one enemy mid-combo, you can chain your combos into another enemy nearby, allowing you to stay on the offensive. You can also cancel combos with dodge rolls and air slides, allowing you to act out of attacks with maneuvering options. They also added some very convenient additions to the combat, such as guarding mid-combo, guarding in mid-air, and being able to use items in mid-air, adding options for the player to heal or act defensively in a tight situation. It also feels more reaction-based than KH2, which focused on being systematic, so it feels more rewarding to learn when to attack, when to block, and when to dodge. One thing I heard a lot of people wrongfully accusing the game of is how enemies don't have detectable moves and just attack randomly, which makes me ask if they even paid attention while playing.
Pay attention.
Back at you!
Enemies give out very clear cues to what attacks they use and when they use them, and it's also possible to dodge and block these attacks in time. Maybe it was because the game was still fresh in everyone's mind and they didn't take notice of enemy behaviors or attack patterns, but after taking the time to play the game more than once, it's actually pretty easy to notice. It adds to the reactionary elements of the game since you have to watch for what certain enemies will do, so you learn to rely on defensive options. Another thing that really works is how there's actually a vast number of mechanics for crowd control. One argument that people have made against the game is how it wasn't made with mob fights in mind and how it's really unbalanced, since there's too many enemies with no proper way to fight them without using links. Well, it's a good thing I did a playthrough without relying on links to prove that wrong. Now that I think about it, it's actually pretty funny how people insisted that there's only one option for taking on mob fights. There's a variety of mechanics that allow you to knock groups away and freely focus on a single enemy. You can airstep an enemy and then use the buzzsaw technique. There's numerous form changes with a wide attack reach like the double yo-yo and the hyper hammer. There's arrow, which acts as a really good competent replacement for magnet, and with the new combat abilities included with the Pre-Mind update, you can even hold off mobs of enemies as base Sora. Having more groups of enemies is actually beneficial for the game with Sora's huge arsenal this time around, making the pacing of the battles evened out instead of ending too quickly or dragging out for too long. And speaking of the pre-Remind combat update, these 6 new abilities are absolutely insane. I honestly didn't care if they ever addressed people complaining about Osaka Team's combat not having the same speed as Tokyo Team since it was perfectly fine the way it was, but they really went well and beyond to make base Sora much faster than before, with these new abilities making him so much snappier and more fluid. They add a lot of improvements to the physics of his movements, having lightning fast reflexes and his attacks having amazing reach. They allow you to quickly transition into magic spells and even allow you to cancel out of combos much faster. Then you have the 2 new Keyblades Oathkeeper and Oblivion, which are infinitely satisfying to use. They have pretty good stats in their base form and their playstyle is really intuitive. They can operate both offensively and defensively and are even capable of doing both at the same time. The physics surrounding their attacks and their movements are extremely swift, adding more speed to the combat than ever before. It adds even more reactionary elements to the game with its layout having a really quick pace to it. There's a lot of flow and momentum to these new abilities and Keyblades that add so many more options to the combat. And knowing that this was part of a free patch outside of the Remind DLC is a really good sign of generosity. But I feel like the real meat to KH3's combat is how Keyblades are involved. In the previous games, it was pretty traditional and simple. You obtain a new weapon after completing an area or fulfilling a task and equip the ones with the most beneficial stats. This game has it too, but with much more depth added to it. Not only do Keyblades have different stats and abilities, but they also have different playstyles that drastically change Sora's behavior in combat. Each form change has a unique functionality, and they each have different mechanics and movesets, adding more strategy and tactics to the battles. There's also a pretty good risk and reward system for each form change. They each have their own pros and cons, making you think about what you're okay with sacrificing in exchange for their benefits. Hyper Hammer has wide attack range but slow movements, Claws and Yo-Yos have fast attacks and good reach but without the ability to perform guard, and Shooting Star allows you to use projectiles and fight from a safe distance in exchange for attack power. They even change the behavior of magic spells so you can further experiment with magic casting if you're a mage builder. These form changes vastly improve the presence of the Keyblades in Sora's arsenal, enhancing their effectiveness and vastly changing how you would normally use each weapon. Additionally, you have the ability to power up each individual Keyblade over time using the Forge system. If there's a particular Keyblade or playstyle you want to stick with, you don't have to worry about it becoming inferior, as you can increase its stats and add new abilities using synthesis material. Through this system, all of the Keyblades can be made more powerful so you're not dealing chip damage, and the modifications you get feel like actual modifications. The Ever After Keyblade can get the Arosa modifier, which vastly increases Sora's crowd controlling capabilities. They add more depth to the forging system as they offer more to each Keyblade than simply increasing their stats. Even better is that you can now switch between 3 of them on the fly. You no longer have to constantly pause the game to change your loadout, as the Keyblade swapping system adds increased accessibility to different weapons. You can quickly switch to a Keyblade with higher magic stats if you want to cast a magic spell, then quickly switch back to a Keyblade with higher strength stats when resuming close combat. And the best part is that Keyblade swapping allows you to save and reserve form changes to help you feel more prepared for certain fights. The form changing system combined with the Keyblade swapping system acts as a great replacement for the drive forms from KH2, allowing you to switch between magic, defense, and offense at any time. It removes an issue from KH1 and 2 where Keyblades with lower stats in early game were no longer viable once you got the ones with higher numbers or dealt more damage. Different Keyblades are given a reason to still be in your arsenal during later points in the game, encouraging experimentation with different weapons. Keyblade forging, form changes, and Keyblade swapping together make for some of the most creative additions to the combat in any Kingdom Hearts game. Switching between weapons on the fly, upgrading them to be more useful over time, and experimenting with all of their different forms and abilities is a much more unique and interesting approach to game design than just sticking with the one with the highest stats and immediately abandoning all the other ones. Even the command menu is vastly improved over KH2, having all of your battle options mapped to a single menu. Now that all your allies can fight at the same time, you don't have to worry about leaving yourself open by switching between 2 menus just to switch out Donald and Goofy. Even using magic feels a lot more useful compared to other games in the series. You can freely move around while casting spells like Wisdom Form from KH2, adding mobility to mage builders. It also has added effects such as freezing enemies, creating ice paths for Sora to grind on, creating tornadoes that Sora can use to jump in the air for an aerial advantage, and even breaking through an enemy's invincibility frames. Magic feels much more involved in the combat than in previous games, as it not only damages enemies but actually affects them in different ways. And you can choose between the 3 levels of magic for each spell instead of permanently being stuck with the highest one. Party members feel more involved in the combat as well, as their attacks deal actual damage this time. They actually feel like they're part of the fight instead of just being there whenever the player wants to use a team attack. Donald isn't constantly dying like he was in KH1 and 2 when he actually heals you when you need it. And the air step ability is one of the most useful additions in a Kingdom Hearts game I've ever seen. At first I thought I was gonna hate it because of this one part in Olympus where the debris is constantly flying around and blocking your target, but after I got past it, it became one of the most useful tools in the entire game. With the level design being much bigger this time around, you can use it to quickly travel across big areas instead of traveling on foot. In combat, you can use it to quickly snap between different enemies from afar. And for those who complained about not being able to cancel out of certain animations, you can even use the air step to cancel out of certain combo finishers. Using air step also slows down time, so you have more time to cancel out of animations and plan out which enemies you're going to snap to next. It works as a really good combo extender and helps you get to safety in stressful situations. It's also very useful for chaining combos in mid-air and allowing you to build a situation gauge more safely during mob fights. And besides air step, you can also use shot locks at any time during a combo, with each Keyblade having a unique shot lock that damages enemies in different ways. Some of them even have supportive abilities such as draining HP from enemies to restore Sora's health, which can be very useful during critical mode. It's actually amazing to see just how many battle options are in this game, with a huge library of different mechanics that don't even break up the gameplay or pull you out of it in a distracting way. There's plenty of opportunities to practice new combinations and tactics, as the enemy roster has been updated with a good amount of variety. And even after all that, there's still several more mechanics in the combat that are worth bringing up. You can further customize the behavior of different party members, such as how often they use certain abilities and healing items. There's also the addition of cooking food in Twilight Town and storing it in the cuisine menu. And consuming these foods gives your entire party a variety of stat bonuses. Increased strength, defense, HP, and even giving you a bonus ability for eating a full course meal. With dozens of possible different food combinations, you can freely customize your bonuses however you like. You even have the ability to save meals and bonuses as a favorite, so they'll permanently be reserved and you don't have to worry about waiting to get them randomly again. It also adds an element of exploration to the game, as certain ingredients for cooking can only be found by exploring different locations in each world. The minigames required to cook food have fair prompts to them, but if you do have a hard time getting an excellent rating, you can make it easier by using gourmet rings. There's also some mech combat during the Toy Story world, where you can engage with enemies using mech toys, each with different classes and different stats. They also included rail combat, in which Sora can fire projectiles at enemies while grinding across different spaces, which actually controls pretty well. And finally, Rage Form acts as a huge improvement over Anti-Form, as there's actual benefits for using it. Unlike Anti-Form showing up randomly, you have the ability to activate Rage Form at any time if you're taking too much damage. It's also easier to control, with less over-the-top movements that help keep Sora in place instead of darting and flying around. You get to keep your party members in this state, and they can still support you while you're using it. You don't take double damage like an Anti-Form, and there's a much better risk and reward system through the risk charge ability, where you can willingly sacrifice HP to amplify your combos or even shortcut to the finisher to exit the form early. It's really satisfying to know that you have so much more control over Rage Form than you did Anti-Form, which was a terrible form and a terrible method of implementing risk and reward in KH2. So with all these combat options and this huge library of mechanics, you'd think that KH3 would have the perfect combat system, right? Well, no. That's really not the case, as there's a number of lame and even terrible mechanics. The first one I should probably bring up is the attraction flows, which are really tedious. At first I was actually pretty interested in this mechanic, as each attraction has a unique control scheme, but after a while I started to notice how cheap they felt. The problem with attraction flows isn't that they control badly, but they just feel like really cheap methods for cheesing through fights. They're really brainless, as they deal far too much damage with no real input from the player. It's also pretty inconsistent how frequent and infrequent they are, so they tend to feel like a really big distraction. When I played through critical mode again, I tried turning them off to see if it would improve the flow of the combat, and it was actually much more satisfying. I know there were a lot of people who got bored and annoyed with attractions after a while, so seeing that critical mode actually gives you the option to turn them off and not be bothered by them is a real treat. But another problem with the game is how, like attraction flows, team attacks seem to appear randomly and you have no real control over when they can be used. They have good mechanics and they're not insanely overpowered like attraction flows, but they feel really inconvenient in how they just show up randomly whenever they want. They tend to be very unreliant when there's situations where you clearly need them, but they completely refuse to show up. It honestly would have been much better if they did something like in Dream Drop Distance, where party members have meters that build up over time and you can activate a team attack when they fill up. Now technically you can work around this problem using the Team Effort ability, which allows you to gain instant access to team attacks at the start of each fight. But good luck doing that without wasting time farming 50 AP for each party member. Another problem is that summons, or links, are fundamentally broken on so many levels. Much like attractions, they feel very cheap and brainless, as they deal extreme amounts of damage at one time with no real input. They do give each one a unique mechanic, but it feels like a really overpowered method of cheesing through fights. And much like attraction flows, this was a mechanic I didn't bother with when playing through critical mode again, which makes summons end up feeling like an afterthought that ends up getting completely excluded from the gameplay. It would honestly be really simple for them to add a patch which vastly reduces the amount of damage they deal, which would allow them to feel more balanced. Risk Dodge is also not a very reliable ability, as there's really no way to anticipate it. With both reprisal attacks and Risk Dodge mapped to the guard system, it's needlessly difficult to tell when you're supposed to press the X button and the circle button, and the game only gives you about a quarter of a second to press the circle button on time. Otherwise you're left with Sora awkwardly standing there and being left open for an attack. Then there's flow motion being a completely pointless feature in this game. It's something carried over from Triple D and it's made really useless here. Not only is it more difficult to control due to the build of certain areas, but they took away its effectiveness in traversing through areas. You can't use it to scale walls like in Triple D, and with the air step mechanic, it just becomes insignificant. It's another mechanic that you'll never actually use because of how useless it is, which makes it just like the links, excluded from the gameplay. There's also a couple of pretty bad platforming sections akin to the terrible platforming in KH1. They're not really reliable and it feels really clunky trying to balance on them. It's not as bad as KH1, but it's still an obnoxious distraction whenever it shows up. Wall running is also not a very good addition, as maneuvering on walls feels really clunky. If you try to maneuver left and right, you end up staggering while completely changing directions when you meant to keep going upward. It's really confusing and it needlessly leaves you open for an attack. Another issue is how they still haven't bothered to bring back manual target switching from KH1. Sometimes you'll end up locking onto an enemy other than the one you're looking at, and trying to lock in and out is really difficult because of how close they are. The L2 and R2 button don't even have any actions mapped to them, so they could have easily been used for switching targets. It would have been really easy for them to bring it back, but they won't do it despite how convenient it would be in a game with mob fights. And for some weird reason, they seem to map jumping and gliding to the same button, which makes it really awkward to use them. I mean, what if I don't want to use double jump? What if I just want to use glide? It's just a really clunky design choice. Obviously, there's the traditional problem in the franchise, as the camera tends to be really problematic in several areas. Your view tends to be blocked or abstracted by something that suddenly shows up on screen, and there's a couple of times where the camera has a really hard time keeping up with the fast-paced action. This is made even worse by how some levels in the game just weren't designed with this type of combat system in mind. There's a bunch of narrow hallways or crowded spaces that don't give the camera room to get a proper focus, leaving you to engage in certain fights while struggling with the other stick. It also tends to do a terrible job focusing on highlighting form changes and team attacks where it gets abstracted while circling around you. It's especially a problem in levels like Corona, where there's a lot of trees and a lot of plant life constantly getting in the way, and in some cases even straight up blocking your attacks. And the ship combat in the Caribbean is horrible. The control over your ship is very slow, so you can't maneuver or act defensively. And it's really unfair that the AI is able to move more freely by default while the player is struggling with the clunky controls. Aiming tends to be a problem, as lining up your shots is really inconsistent. Enemy ships tend to spawn from really far away, and with them constantly moving, you'll end up missing several of your shots. What makes it even worse is that there's a whole bunch of stuff constantly blocking your view. Whether it's the enemy ships, your own sails, or the smoke that emits from your ship as you take damage. You'll hardly get a clear shot, and even when you do, your focus is constantly being broke up by too many enemy ships attacking from too many directions. There's also this bullshit where ships inconveniently disappear and then teleport to the other side of the map with no warning, which can often result in your specials being wasted. This is a problem that was thankfully fixed with the addition of the free pass codes, as activating the deadly blow cheat actually affects the enemy ships. Now you don't have to worry about your time being wasted on these horrible ship battles, as you can just instant kill the enemy ships. There's also these terrible status ailments, such as being set on fire, rain clouds that stun you, and being left in a daze that were added for no reason other than to slow down the gameplay and take control away from the player. They leave Sora in obnoxious stun locks that leave him unfairly open for enemy attacks, which is especially harmful during early game critical mode where you can die more quickly. You can work around some of these ailments by equipping keyblades that nullify them, but there isn't a keyblade for all of them, so you're still dealing with fire asses and thunderclouds that get in the way needlessly. And the Penenta item feels useless, as almost all of the ailments are tied to immobilizing Sora, so you can't even use them while they're in effect. Finally, and I really can't stress this one enough,
Settle down!
Sleep for all eternity.
the guard system in this game is awful. Like, really fucking awful. I have no idea why I never noticed this when I originally reviewed the game, because if I did, I would have definitely brought it up. And this isn't just me. Everybody and their grandmother who's played this game can tell you how horrible the guard system is. Aside from not having the invincibility frames from KH2, it doesn't even work when it's supposed to. It doesn't properly detect enemy attacks, often pushing back against Sora, which prevents him from countering, or straight up attacking right through the guard itself. There's so many times where even if you guard correctly, the ability to use wrist dodge doesn't even show up, resulting in you losing a fair advantage. And aside from that, it's painfully inconsistent. There are times where you'll clearly block an attack successfully, but then the same attack will outright damage you through the guard, and the game doesn't take the time to tell you what you did wrong. With the way critical mode requires the player to act more defensively, it comes across as really unreliable and untrustworthy. The cooldown for using it is way too slow, and it doesn't give you the invincibility frames during the cooldown, which was something that gave players a fighting chance in KH2. The hitbox for this ability flat out disappears half the time, meaning that even if Sora clearly has his Keyblade in front of him and facing the attack, it flat out ignores it and still you get hit. It's a very serious issue that should have been patched a dozen times over by now. But even to this day, even with the Remind DLC and the latest update, the guard system is still fundamentally broken. I have no idea if this shitty guard system was intentional or if it was a glitch in the system, but with all the problems they addressed by this point, you'd think this would have been one of them. The closest thing I can think of that probably counts as a fix to this problem is the auto block cheat that came with the Fast Pass menu, but even with it enabled, you still take damage during the cooldown. It's a huge problem because you can't act defensively when the guard system is constantly fucking you over. It greatly interferes with enjoyability of the game and is a problem that shouldn't even be there in the first place. Alright, so I admit that the combat in Cage 3 may have had more issues than I noticed the first time. But on the other hand, there were actually a lot of beneficial details I didn't notice before. It's actually amazing how many battle options and mechanics are in this game, and it was really satisfying to revisit the battle system in different ways. Trying out different tactics, using everything the game has to offer, experimenting with all these different options and possibilities, figuring out which keyblades and which strategies work best. It's really some of the best gameplay in the series to date. And I have to admit it's a good thing critical mode came along, otherwise we wouldn't be able to really appreciate any of this stuff. One thing that a lot of people talked about during the game's initial release is how it was really easy, with the game handing out situation commands like candy, broken spammable magic, links restoring your full health making cure an obsolete option, and since you could easily win by just mashing the X button, there was really no motivation for the player to experiment with the game's mechanics to try out other options. Critical mode takes care of that problem swimmingly by adjusting dozens of mechanics to make the player feel less overpowered. The situation gauge builds much more slowly, so now form changes feel like an actual reward for performing well in combat. MP is cut in half to prevent magic spamming. Links no longer restore you to full health, making cure a viable option, all which help critical mode to be challenging without it being super restricting. The mode encourages you to be more vigilant, to be more aware of the enemy's movements and training yourself to act more defensively and experiment with different tactics. Similar to Kingdom Hearts 2, you also get some additional abilities to help you out, but one big difference from Cage 2 is how these abilities are exclusive to this mode. These new critical abilities actually allow you to customize the difficulty even further, and that's some really good design. On top of having a difficulty selection, you now have further options within that difficulty you selected. All of these things put together help to give critical mode a real sense of balance that was missing in other difficulties. Now you have to use everything in your arsenal and learn enemy movements while utilizing crowd control in order to proceed in the game. Now, a lot of people have criticized critical mode for being punishing instead of challenging, which is actually pretty overblown considering the balancing options given to the player. It can be punishing if you don't know what you're doing, or if you're one of those people who just gives up and cheeses the game using links. As I've said before, there's a number of options for crowd control, as well as quickly snapping to different enemies, canceling Sora's attack animations, and building the situation gauge in a safe manner. It does take some time to get used to, but once you get the hang of it, it's a really appropriate challenge for your reactionary skills. You can improve how you approach certain enemies, and there's a steady increase in power so you're not suddenly spiking as you get to later levels. You can also do things like keyblade forging and cooking food for cuisine bonuses to further increase your stats. The nerfs in this mode feel fair as they don't restrict Sora's ability to act, and they help to teach the player to rely on other options during combat. And the number of options you have really help the player in terms of instigating fights. But if by some chance you want to make the game even harder, there's also the addition of the premium menu that gives you access to the black code mode as well as free pass mode. It's actually a pretty good concept overall, as you can further customize the difficulty to your liking. You can make it really easy, really hard, or even a little bit of both. The free pass mode in particular is really useful for speeding up the game's pacing by shortening the process of farming items and level grinding. With Deadly Blow and MP regain combined, you can actually go to battle gates and spam Thundaga to quickly kill entire groups of enemies at a breakneck pace, farming experience points, money, and synthesis items a lot faster than in any other Kingdom Hearts game. You also have the boss fights, which is another thing the game does pretty well, at least for the most part. It doesn't have as many as Cage 2, but the mechanics behind each one are well designed. They each have an appropriate amount of health and attack patterns for the player to learn. In terms of quality, Cage 3 actually has the most consistent boss quality of the three main games. Unlike Cage 1 and Cage 2, where there were good bosses and horrible bosses constantly following up each other throughout the game, the bosses in Cage 3 almost always have the same level of quality back to back. Some of them are tougher than others, but they all have the fundamental basis of challenging the player's ability to react to their attack patterns and movements. There's some that require more practice than others, but for the most part, you never feel like you're taking damage unfairly. You know, unless the guard system decides to screw you over. I see a lot of people criticizing Raging Vulture for being Ruler of the Sky 2.0, but it really doesn't have the same design flaws. The flight controls do take some time to get used to, but once you get the hang of it, it's actually a pretty simple boss encounter. There's visual cues for the player to use aerial dodge, and aiming your weapons on the Vulture works as it should. There are some camera issues, but aside from that, it's really not as bad as Ruler of the Sky. A much worse boss would have to be the Lich, where the game forces you to fight the same guy 7 times in a row. He's constantly summoning minions that deliberately distract you from the fight, and several of the areas you're teleported to are horrible, such as the Dark Forest from Corona. He doesn't even have an impressive moveset. He just spams the same magic spells over and over, and each phase ends really fast. It would have been simpler to just have all of his health at one time so it doesn't feel like the battle is constantly being put on pause. There's also the horrendous Kraken boss fight that just completely solidifies how awful the ship combat is. It turns the fight into a shitty escort mission, as you not only have to focus on damaging the Kraken, but also protect your allies from being destroyed. The game makes it needlessly frustrating as it crops your view of the battlefield, so you can't even see when enemy ships are coming unless you stop shooting at the Kraken to turn the camera around. Enemy ships also spawn from really far away, making it really difficult to line your shots, and your concentration is just constantly being broken up between the Kraken, the enemy ships, and the remaining health of your allies. Even your ability to even damage the Kraken is constantly being disrupted by a bunch of stupid stuff blocking your shots. And finally, I have to admit that I was really too kind on the organization battles when I first reviewed this game, because they're really terrible in hindsight. The gimmick behind these fights is that you have to battle 2 to 3 members at one time, focusing attacks on one member while anticipating attacks from the other. The only problem is that the concept was executed horribly, and it's basically because the camera does a terrible job focusing on 2 enemies at one time. You end up taking damage from things that are completely off screen, and their quick movesets combined with the terrible camera issues make it really hard to anticipate what's coming at you. You're never allowed to focus on a single target since they interrupt you out of nowhere, sometimes teleporting right in front of you and not giving you enough time to dodge. What's even worse is that once you take away the aspect of fighting them in groups, these bosses are insultingly easy. Because these bosses were meant to be fought in groups, they're not allowed to be a threat by themselves. They don't have big movesets, their attacks are incredibly easy to predict, and they don't even have that much health. Once you take out their partners, they completely stop being a threat. It's a good thing these boss fights were updated with the Remind DLC because these base forms were just really pathetic. So, with all that stuff out of the way, what's left to talk about? Well, actually there's quite a lot. Not a lot of people seem to admit it, but it actually has a sizable amount of content that's appropriate for a game of this caliber. The area select mechanic allows you to travel to different locations within worlds more quickly, so you don't have to constantly go in and out of the gummy ship to get somewhere. It's a really good mode of transportation considering how much bigger the worlds are. I've also gotten a much better hang of the swimming controls since I last reviewed this game. It's actually not as bad as I first thought it was, and the underwater combat, while slower, still has a decent flow to it. The synthesis system is the absolute best in the entire franchise. The requirements for gaining access to more recipes is much better than in KH1 and 2. All you have to do is simply collect different materials throughout the game instead of being forced to level up the shop or create everything else before getting the Ultima weapon. You can even gain access to certain items by simply buying them at the store instead of having to synthesize them after getting the Mog card. It's also far less time consuming as you get more shards, stones, gems, and crystals than you can count. And you can gain access to the best armor, weapons, and accessories much earlier than in previous games. You can even farm the Lucky Strike ability by playing the Verum Rex minigame and getting the high score, so you can get synthesis items even more rapidly. And speaking of minigames, there's actually a pretty big variety, and much like the last 2 games, there's some good ones and not so good ones. The Verum Rex minigame allows you to freely have fun with the mech combat from Toy Box, testing your skills and rewarding you with items for playing well. The Sunflower Dance from Corona is a much better rhythm game than Atlantica from KH2, with its festive music, better controls, and reasonable timing mechanics. And of course, there's a whole bunch of minigames made available with the classic Kingdom mode. These minigames are a lot of fun to try out. They have a pretty good nostalgic retro design to them, and they also take advantage of their small control layouts to prevent them from feeling redundant. But then you have minigames like the Shugio Race Course, which is terrible at implementing flow motion into its design. The control you have over Sora is way too loose, and everything just feels really terribly positioned. And the Winnie the Pooh world is literally the exact same minigame 3 times in a row. There's no variety like in KH1 and 2, and you're not even given a motivation to be in the book. The first 2 games gave Sora a reason to be there since there was a conflict involving missing pages. But here, you go in the book just because Sora isn't on the cover and Pooh has to be taught the exact same lesson he learned the first 2 times. And of course you have the terrible, horrible, awful Flan minigames scattered throughout the worlds. I mean, what can I say about these shitty minigames that hasn't already been said? The garbage controls, the repetitive mechanics, the time limits that don't give you enough time to get the high scores, creating conditions where you automatically lose, and how the game is forcing you to do these things in order to gain access to the Ultima weapon. They're just really, really bad. But aside from minigames, there's actually still other pieces of content worth discussing. Most notably, how it has the best gummy ship mode in the franchise. They actually took the time to give the ship its own open world with a huge amount of open space. You can do things like collect treasure, shoot asteroids to gather material, farm money, travel through vacuums to quickly transport yourself across the map, and even take pictures of constellations. And unlike KH2, the battles take place from one point of view, so you're able to focus on them instead of switching to different perspectives. The controls for both free roaming and space battles are really tight and responsive, Retrospective, and they have a really amazing visual appeal that encourages the player to explore everything there is to see. The additions they made to the Gummy Ship mode in KH3 are everything that you could possibly want from the Gummy Ship mode, giving it an actual reason to be in the game instead of just being a minigame as a segment for traveling in between levels. There's also the addition of your teammates being much more interactive this time around. Instead of just having generic battle dialogue, they actually talk and communicate with each other as you travel across each level. The quips they make to each other are rather fun to listen to, and there's a ton of Easter dialogue to find to keep you entertained. But the best side content is the Lucky Emblem side quest, which acts very much like a hidden Mickey hunt from various parks in Disney World. Searching for these hidden Mickeys is a really good reward in and of itself, as you not only obtain exclusive items, but it's a side quest that rewards the player for being observant and paying attention to their surroundings. Many of these hidden Mickeys are really cleverly hidden, requiring the player to be very vigilant, and it greatly adds to the game's exploration elements as you travel to many different corners of each level to find them. It's also an improvement over the puzzle pieces from KH2. Instead of being forced to level up the drive forms in order to access them, these hidden Mickeys can actually be accessed at any point once you know where to find them. But if there was one piece of side content that was absolutely terrible, it would definitely have to be the battle gates and the Dark Inferno boss fight, all of which are horrible excuses for greater challenges after beating the main story. The battle gates are just recycled enemies you've already defeated throughout the game with higher HP and attack power, while Dark Inferno is a laughable excuse for a super boss. He's not even a hard boss, his attacks just deal stupid damage. He has a really small moveset with attacks that are incredibly easy to get around, and you can easily beat him at level 50 and under. Even if you were to restrict yourself, you still wouldn't feel very challenged by this enemy because his design is just so unremarkable. Well, at least we got worthwhile super bosses through the DLC. Finally, there's the different worlds you explore throughout the game, which are mostly designed pretty well, with some of them being very underwhelming. The build for many of these worlds is pretty spirited and creative, and they also have their own unique scheme, so you're visiting a wide variety of different places instead of the same linear location 8 times. The levels in general just feel so much bigger than in previous games, with wider fields that help them to feel a lot less linear. They have big open spaces adding mobility to the battles, which gives Sora a lot more free room to maneuver in. There's also a number of background elements that the player can freely interact with. Helium tanks, Rock'em Sock'em toys, smashing an Achilles heel statue, giant snowballs that can be used to damage enemies. There's even a section of the game that rewards the player for interacting with the background elements in Corona. A lot of people have wrongfully criticized the game for the worlds feeling bare and empty with nothing to do or interact with, but these things help the world feel like something you can be a part of. Some worlds even change and develop different looks over time, making them feel a lot more alive as the passage of time actually affects them. There's also a few areas where they took the time to implement towns and they feel like actual towns, with NPCs you can interact with and perform street dancing to earn some extra money. Toy Box alone has a really interesting approach to it as it takes full advantage of the characters being turned into toys. Exploring a multi-floor mall, traveling through vents, interacting with the stores, stealing from registers, turning something as simple as a neighborhood street into a wide field for exploration and combat. They even did a pretty good job recreating Andy's room. Olympus allows you to fully explore the setting of the movie it's based on instead of just being confined to the Colosseum. And it also has a side quest where you can collect action figures and give them to a collector for an extra piece of armor. Corona has a lush environment with a vibrant and really beautiful color scheme. And it also has a town where you can explore a fishing dock and a market to collect food for cooking. Monstropolis is a fun area to go through as the way it's put together makes it feel like you're actually exploring a factory. It's pretty interesting to see how all the areas tie together to form a lively interpretation of the factory from the movie. And the Caribbean is really huge with a lot of open land and ocean to explore, and dozens of islands you can investigate for extra items. A lot of people bring up the crab collecting for how annoying it is, but after you figure out the routes and the path that's quickest for collecting them, it's really not as bad as people say it is. You can actually finish collecting the crabs in 5 minutes if you know where to go. But for every good world in this game, there's also some pretty bad ones. The most infamous example being Arendelle, which is constantly forcing you to backtrack and go up and down the same snowy mountain 3 times throughout the story. It's not really fun to explore as it doesn't have a unique scheme like the other worlds. It's just snow and ice, which gets really boring the more time you spend there. The ice labyrinth is also pretty confusing as everything in the environment just looks the same. It's extremely linear and a lot of the closed up spaces don't suit the combat very well. And that's not even including the terrible avalanche sliding segment or the infamous Olaf minigame. It forces you to listen to the exact same bits of dialogue played on loop over and over and over until you find all of Olaf's body parts. It gets annoying very fast, especially for anyone who's going through this part for the first time and has no idea where they're supposed to be looking. Granted, the body parts are set in the same location each time and not random, so you can quickly end this part after knowing where to look. But the fact that it's even in the game at all just makes it all the more annoying because of how obviously it was placed there just to consume your time. It doesn't further the story, and it's not even fun. It's just pointless filler that gets worse and worse every time you're forced to redo it. And it ends with a terrible snowstorm segment that repeatedly pushes the player back, so you need to take cover in order to move forward. But the snowstorm often doesn't give you enough time to get to cover, and it greatly knocks you back, forcing you to repeat entire segments. The player's movement is extremely slow, and even if you can snap to cover with the triangle button, the game will still knock you back and force you to work your way back to your earlier position. Arendelle is easily the worst world in the game because unlike 100 Acre Wood, it's not optional. You're forced to replay this world every single time you play through the game, and so much of the stuff revolving around it just feels like it was made specifically to annoy you. As for the 100 Acre Wood, it's a completely pointless world as it feels like it was only placed in the game out of obligation. Aside from not having a conflict to solve or a diverse variety of minigames, you don't even get to explore the world like in previous games. The only area made available to you is Rabbit's Garden, which is really small and crowded. Then there's San Francisco, which is probably the least bad. It's a really huge area, but it ultimately feels barren because of how little there is to actually do. The way the story is paced is also really rushed and jumbled, as the game's narrative only takes place in small portions of the city and doesn't take full advantage of its design. When compared to worlds like Toy Box and Monstropolis, it just comes across as pretty underwhelming. The final world is nothing but shitty platforming mechanics, as the game forces you to collect 111 pieces of Sora in order to proceed in the game. And if you wanted to max out your HP, you had to collect another 222 fragments, which is a lot more painful than it sounds. It's extremely time-consuming and boring, as you're constantly wrestling with the buggy platform controls while struggling to collect fragments that are constantly moving around. They're scattered very widely across the area, which tends to confuse the player as they're constantly backtracking to find any fragments they missed. It gets even more terrible as you're also forced to hit these spinning blocks in order to change the gravity to gain access to other platforms. You have no way of knowing which blocks are supposed to help you, and sometimes they act against the player by turning the gravity away from areas containing plentiful fragments. Now there is one area that they actually improved through the DLC, and that was making Scala at Kylum a fully explorable environment. Understandably, people were upset that this world was regulated to being a backdrop, as Nomura said in an interview that he was discussing making this world fully explorable. It felt like false advertising that for all the talk about this being an explorable world, it's just a setting for a boss battle. With the DLC, there's an area in this world that's fully explorable, and it's very well made. There's environments you can interact with and explore for extra items, as well as rails that can help you travel across the area faster. There's open spaces that give you freedom of movement during combat, and none of the horrible platforming in previous levels. You can freely roam around the area in search of Kairi's fragments, and they're pretty cleverly hidden or blocked out, requiring the player to observe their surroundings and pay close attention to figure out how to get them. It also has a pretty nice visual appeal to it, with a color scheme that meshes together well and a soothing and comforting aura to its aesthetic. The Remind DLC also adds the ability to play as different characters during the Keyblade War. Each of them have their own unique styles and move patterns that allow you to re-challenge the org members in different ways. Each of them control pretty well, as they feel similar to controlling Sora while also having their own unique scheme. There's also updates for certain cutscenes through a free patch, and they're actually pretty good updates overall. Not only did they enhance the visuals, but they also added new music to better fit the scenarios. The new track that plays over Kairi's death is a lot more fitting, as it makes the scene a lot more effective and dramatic, raising the tension and having a much more appropriate tone. Even the new skybox that they used during the opening of Kingdom Hearts sets the mood a lot better with its daybreak textures than the generic cloudy grayness from before. The DLC does make an effort to clear up plot holes and missing elements from the original endgame, though it doesn't really add much outside of just seeing the story from a different perspective. But the added context does help to make it feel less rushed. They show what happened to Lingering Will and give an explanation for how Xion came back. Axel contributes to the battle against Saix and Xemnas. Kairi teams up with Sora in the final battle against Xehanort, and she actually gets to play an important role in the war. As a whole, I do respect the DLC for clearing up missing elements and adding important details to the endgame, but it sadly doesn't fix the story overall, as it's still a really big mess. The pacing is terrible, the important elements are needlessly crammed into the last third, too much time is spent on foreshadowing the next game, and it comes across as sort of anticlimactic for the tone they were establishing. And the DLC forces you to play through most of the exact same things with the exact same cutscenes, and there's no added option to skip over the parts you already saw in the base game. Even the battle against Luxor, Marluxia, and Larcene plays out exactly the same way as in the main game, and you don't even get the option to play as Mickey Mouse. Why would they give us the ability to play as all these different characters and not give us the ability to play as Mickey Mouse? What's the point of making us go through this fight again if there's nothing different about it? It just feels like the first half of the DLC has you going around in a really big circle. But even with its bad story, Kingdom Hearts 3's base form was actually pretty satisfying. For what they put out back in January 2019, there was enough content to help the experience feel like a complete game. And the Remind DLC, along with free patches and updates, added further elements that felt like they were missing. They made the combat faster, they improved the physics of the game, they balanced out the difficulty, they gave you the option to turn off attraction moves, they added Oathkeeper and Oblivion, they added a dual-wielding form, they made Scala explorable, they added the ability to play as other characters, they added 16 new boss fights with the updated armor Xehanort, the Guardians of Light group fight, the Data battles, and the Azora battle. They added story elements that were missing from the base game. They added New Game Plus, which allows you to carry your Keyblades over to a new save file. They added a feature to edit the game's difficulty even further. They even orchestrated 13 new soundtracks for each individual Data battle. Honestly, the amount of content they added over the course of 1 year is pretty insane. As I said before, the game has many notable problems that really haven't aged well with time. Some of the worlds are boring to get through, the links are overpowered, half the minigames are terrible, the guard system is absolutely shit, and the story is all over the place to the point that it just feels boring. Playing the game again, there were so many instances where I just wanted to skip the cutscenes as I forgot just how terrible the pacing was. It's a real shame too, because with all the stuff they put out, KH3 had the potential to surpass KH2 as the best game in the series, only to end up having several of the problems KH2 had and even some new problems of its own. But even with those flaws, KH3 still manages to be a really good game. It's still amazing just how many combat options and battle mechanics they added, and it's impressive to see how they found a way to balance the game out with all these crazy additions. It's not the best game of 2019, but it's definitely a fun experience from beginning to end. With what they did with Kingdom Hearts 3, I'm actually interested in seeing what they can do with the series moving forward. Maybe when they get around to telling a different story, they'll be able to have a better focus on it. Though I'm not exactly sure what they can do to further expand on the gameplay, as everything they've done up to this point is actually pretty insane. Well, we'll just have to wait and see. Anyway, thanks for taking the time to watch my review. If you want to support more videos like this one, you can feel free to check out my Patreon in the description. With Kingdom Hearts 3 finally over and done with, I'm hoping to move forward and find other things to talk about. Until such a time comes, I'll be seeing you around. Thanks for watching, and have a nice day. This is Map signing out.